The first-class cabin was quiet, polished, and calm, the kind of silence that feels expensive. Soft lighting reflected off polished surfaces. The low hum of engines blended with the gentle rustle of newspapers and the tapping of laptop keys. Business executives settled into their wide leather seats, sipping sparkling water and checking emails before takeoff. Then he walked in. Steven Seagal. No entourage. No dramatic entrance. Just a tall, composed man dressed in a dark jacket and black shirt, moving with unshakable calm. His presence wasn't loud, but it carried weight. He located his seat beside the window and placed his small carry-on neatly overhead. As he sat down, the man next to him, a sharply dressed businessman in an expensive tailored suit, glanced sideways. That glance turned into a slow, deliberate stare. Judgment formed instantly. The businessman leaned toward a flight attendant and whispered, not quietly enough, "Excuse me, are you sure he's supposed to be sitting here?" The attendant looked confused. "Yes, sir. That is his assigned seat." The businessman forced a thin smile but didn't hide his irritation. Steven heard every word. But he didn't react. He calmly fastened his seatbelt and looked out the window, watching the airport crew move beneath the wing. The businessman shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. He scanned Steven again, the simple clothes, the quiet demeanor, the lack of flashy accessories. To him, first class meant loud success, obvious wealth, visible status. Steven didn't look like what he expected. And that was enough. The businessman muttered under his breath. First class used to have standards. A nearby passenger looked up briefly. The air shifted. Steven remained still. There was no anger in his expression. No embarrassment. Just control. The businessman adjusted his cufflinks and crossed his legs, trying to reclaim some invisible authority. But something about Steven's calm presence unsettled him. Sometimes silence is more powerful than response. And sometimes, the people who appear the quietest carry the strongest stories. The cabin doors began to close. Seatbelt signs illuminated. The tension hadn't exploded yet. But it was building. Because the businessman had no idea who he was sitting next to. And within the next hour, the entire first-class cabin would wish they had recorded what was about to happen. As the aircraft began taxiing toward the runway, the tension between the two men didn't fade, it intensified. The businessman adjusted his tie and glanced sideways again. "So," he said casually, though his tone carried sharp edges, "what exactly do you do?" Steven kept his eyes forward. "I teach," he replied calmly. The businessman raised an eyebrow. "Teach what?" "Discipline, focus, self-control." The answer was steady, unbothered. The businessman let out a soft laugh. "Oh, that doesn't exactly scream first-class success, does it?" A passenger across the aisle looked up from her magazine. The engines roared louder as the plane accelerated down the runway, but the businessman's commentary didn't stop. "Most people up here are CEOs, investors, leaders," he continued. "You know, high achievers." Steven turned his head slightly. "Success isn't always loud." The sentence was simple, but it carried weight. The businessman smirked. "Sure. But usually it's visible." There it was. The real meaning behind his words. "You don't look like you belong here." The plane lifted into the sky, and for a moment, silence filled the cabin. But once they reached cruising altitude, the businessman leaned closer again. "No offense," he added, clearly meaning some, "but first class isn't exactly a charity section." A couple of passengers now openly listened. The flight attendant passing by slowed down slightly, sensing something off. Steven remained composed. His breathing steady. His posture relaxed. The businessman, however, seemed restless. Sometimes when someone radiates calm confidence, it unsettles those who depend on external validation. And that's exactly what was happening here. The businessman needed to feel superior. And Steven's quiet presence threatened that. Pause for a second. Have you ever seen someone judged unfairly just because of how they looked? Be honest. Drop your opinion in the comments. And I'm genuinely curious. Which country and city are you watching from right now? Are you watching from Dubai? London? New York, Karachi, Toronto. Comment your country plus city below. Let's see how global this story really is. Back inside the cabin, the businessman crossed his arms confidently. You must have gotten lucky with this seat. Steven finally turned fully toward him. No, he said evenly. I paid for it. The businessman blinked. There was no aggression in Steven's voice. No sarcasm. Just fact. That somehow made it worse. Because arrogance feeds off reaction. And Steven wasn't giving him any. The businessman leaned back again, louder this time. Well, I guess anyone can buy a ticket. Doesn't mean they belong. Now the cabin felt different. The energy had shifted. Passengers exchanged subtle glances. A young man too rose back, discreetly unlocked his phone camera. The businessman didn't notice. He thought he was winning this exchange. But what he didn't understand was something deeper. True power doesn't compete. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to prove its worth to strangers on airplanes. Steven folded his hands calmly. He wasn't intimidated. He wasn't angry. He was observing. And the businessman, without realizing it, was digging himself into a situation he wouldn't be able to escape from. Because very soon, the truth about the quiet man in seat 2A was going to change everything. And when it did, regret would hit harder than turbulence at 35,000 feet. At 35,000 feet above the ground, the cabin lights dimmed slightly as passengers settled into the rhythm of the flight. But the tension in row 2 was far from settling. The businessman shifted again in his seat, clearly irritated by Steven's calm silence. Most people would have reacted by now. Most people would have snapped. But Steven hadn't. And that composure felt like a silent challenge. The businessman leaned forward, raising his voice just enough for the surrounding rows to hear. You know, he said, adjusting his cufflinks, first class is usually for people who've actually achieved something significant. A few heads turned immediately. The words were no longer subtle. They were meant to sting. Steven slowly turned his head. His expression didn't change. What makes you think I haven't? He asked quietly. The businessman smirked. Oh, come on. Let's be realistic. There was a faint laugh under his breath, the kind meant to belittle. A woman across the aisle froze mid-sip of her drink. A young traveler behind them leaned forward slightly. The atmosphere had shifted from awkward to uncomfortable. The businessman wasn't just being arrogant now. He was performing. Performing dominance. Trying to establish hierarchy. Sometimes, when someone feels the need to embarrass another person publicly, it's not about truth. It's about control. And control often comes from insecurity. The businessman continued. I mean, what exactly do you teach again? Discipline. Self-control. He chuckled. Interesting career choice. Steven's eyes locked with his for a brief moment. Very interesting, Steven replied. The simplicity of that response somehow made the businessman more frustrated. Because arrogance feeds on reaction. And Steven was starving it. The businessman leaned back dramatically. I just think first class should maintain a certain standard. There it was again. Standard. Translation. You don't fit my image of success. Steven remained composed. But now the entire row was listening. You could feel it. The quiet electricity. Pause the story here. Let me ask you something. If someone tried to embarrass you publicly like this, what would you do? A. Stay completely silent. B. Confront them immediately. C. Respond calmly but firmly. Comment A, B, or C below. And tell me honestly, does staying calm show strength or weakness? I want to hear your opinion. Back to the cabin. The businessman wasn't done. People work their entire lives to sit up here, he said loudly. It's not for everyone. Steven's voice remained low. Respect is for everyone. That line landed differently. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't aggressive. It was measured. And suddenly, the businessman realized something uncomfortable. The room wasn't on his side anymore. Passengers weren't nodding at him. They were watching him. Judging him. The power dynamic was shifting. He cleared his throat. Well, I just believe achievements should be obvious. Steven's gaze didn't waver. Real achievements don't need advertising. Silence. Heavy silence. Even the faint hum of the engines seemed louder now. A flight attendant paused mid-aisle, sensing the shift. The businessman felt the eyes around him. For the first time since boarding, his confidence flickered. He had expected an argument. Maybe anger. Maybe embarrassment. Instead, he was facing something much harder to defeat. Composure. There is something deeply unsettling about a person who cannot be provoked. It forces the aggressor to confront themselves. And that's uncomfortable. The businessman attempted one final push. So tell me, he said, forcing a tight smile, what's your greatest achievement? The question hung in the air. Passengers leaned in slightly. Steven paused. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because he didn't feel the need to justify himself. I've spent my life teaching people how to control themselves, he finally said. The businessman laughed again. That's it. Steven met his eyes. That's everything. And something about the way he said it made the laughter stop. Completely. The businessman looked around. The cabin was no longer reacting to him. It was observing him. The man who thought he was asserting dominance now looked like someone trying too hard. And Steven? He hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't insulted him. He hadn't bragged. But somehow, he was winning. Because true authority doesn't shout. It doesn't demand recognition. It doesn't need applause. It commands presence. And the businessman was beginning to feel something new creeping in. Doubt. He still didn't know who Steven was. But he was starting to realize. He might have miscalculated. And very soon, the truth was going to make that realization painfully clear. The cabin had grown unusually quiet. Not the peaceful silence of a long flight, but the tense kind. The kind where everyone senses something is unfolding. The businessman shifted in his seat again, though this time his movements weren't as confident. He adjusted his jacket and glanced around, noticing a few passengers still watching. But he brushed it off. He believed he was still in control. Steven, meanwhile, had returned his gaze to the window, looking out at the endless stretch of clouds. Calm. Unbothered. Almost detached from the tension that had formed around him. A few rows back, a young man studying his phone squinted slightly. He looked up. Looked again. Then leaned toward the woman next to him. Wait, he whispered quietly. Isn't that Steven Seagal? The woman glanced forward subtly. Her eyes widened. I think it is. The whisper traveled. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But steadily. Like ripples spreading across still water. Another passenger leaned into the aisle for a clearer look. A quiet murmur began forming in the background. The businessman noticed the subtle shift. He frowned. What? He muttered under his breath. But no one responded. Because now people weren't listening to him anymore. They were looking at Steven. Phones discreetly came out, not obvious enough to disrupt the cabin, but noticeable enough to change the atmosphere. The businessman felt it. That subtle shift in attention. The invisible spotlight moving away from him. And insecurity does not handle lost attention well. He cleared his throat loudly. So, he said, forcing a chuckle, I guess modesty is your brand. Steven slowly turned his head. Respect is, he replied. Again, calm. Even. Controlled. But this time, the line hit differently. Because now the context was changing. The businessman didn't yet understand why. But the cabin did. Recognition was building. There's something fascinating about how quickly perception changes when identity is revealed. Moments ago, Steven was just a man who didn't belong. Now, whispers were reshaping the narrative. The truth hadn't even been officially announced yet. But awareness was spreading. It raises an important question. Why do we treat people differently once we know their status? Should respect depend on fame? Or should it exist regardless? Let me ask you something. If the businessman had known who Steven was from the beginning, do you think he would have acted differently? Be honest. Comment yes or no below. And tell me why. Back in row 2. The businessman leaned forward again, though his confidence was no longer solid. What's so interesting? He asked sharply, noticing a few people glancing his way. A passenger 2 rows ahead simply smiled politely. Nothing more. That silence was louder than any insult. Steven adjusted his seat slightly, still composed. He hadn't confirmed anything. He hadn't announced anything. He wasn't seeking validation. That quiet strength was becoming undeniable. The businessman's jaw tightened. There's something deeply unsettling about realizing you might have underestimated someone. And that realization was beginning to sink in. Another whisper floated through the cabin. He's a martial arts legend. I saw one of his seminars years ago. He trained special forces. The businessman's breathing shifted slightly. He stared at Steven more carefully now, trying to reconcile the image in front of him with the murmurs around him. The simple clothes. The quiet demeanor. The steady presence. Could it be? But pride is a powerful thing. And pride doesn't like admitting mistakes. Instead of backing down, the businessman tried one more subtle jab. Well, he said, forcing a smile, I guess some people are just really good at pretending. Steven's eyes met his. There was no anger in them. Only clarity. I don't pretend, Steven said softly. The tone wasn't threatening. It wasn't defensive. It was grounded. And somehow, that made it even more powerful. The businessman felt something unfamiliar creeping in. Uncertainty. He looked around again. This time, he noticed it clearly. The attention wasn't admiration for him. It was quiet judgment. The role had reversed. Without Steven raising his voice. Without revealing anything. Without bragging. The cabin energy had shifted entirely. Because sometimes, the strongest presence in the room doesn't need to prove itself. It simply waits. And the truth reveals itself naturally. The businessman swallowed. For the first time since boarding, he felt small. Not because Steven had attacked him, but because the situation was slipping out of his control. And he could sense it. He just didn't know yet that in a few moments, an official confirmation would arrive. And when it did, regret wouldn't just whisper. It would hit like a headline. By now, the air inside the first-class cabin felt heavier than the altitude outside. The whispers hadn't stopped. They had only grown quieter, more focused. The businessman could feel it. That invisible shift in atmosphere. He straightened his posture, trying to reclaim confidence that had slowly started slipping through his fingers. Steven remained composed, hands resting calmly in his lap. No irritation. No ego. Just presence. But the businessman wasn't ready to surrender control. So, he said again, forcing a confident tone, I guess silence is your strategy. Steven turned slowly toward him. It's called self-control. The reply was measured. Steady. The businessman gave a thin smile. Well, sometimes people stay quiet because they don't have much to say. A couple of passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. The line was meant to provoke. One last attempt to dominate the exchange. Steven looked directly at him now. Not aggressively. Not challengingly. Just directly. I've spent my life teaching discipline, he said calmly. And discipline begins with knowing when not to speak. The businessman's jaw tightened. That sounds convenient. Steven didn't react to the sarcasm. Instead, he leaned back slightly and continued. You see, real strength isn't loud. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't announce itself. The businessman scoffed. Strength, he said. You're talking like you're some kind of master. The irony of that statement hung in the air. Several passengers now openly watched. No one pretended to scroll their phones anymore. The cabin had turned into a silent audience. Steven's voice remained even. The strongest people in a room are usually the calmest. The businessman felt the attention shifting further away from him. And that unsettled him more than any insult could have. Because he had expected a fight. He had expected anger. But he was facing something harder to attack. Composure. There's something powerful about someone who refuses to match negative energy. When one person escalates and the other remains grounded, the contrast becomes obvious. Aggression exposes insecurity. Calmness exposes confidence. And right now, everyone in that cabin could see the difference. The businessman adjusted his watch nervously. "Let's be honest," he said more quietly now. "First class isn't just about money. It's about accomplishment." Steven nodded slightly. "You're right." The businessman seemed briefly satisfied, until Steven continued. "But accomplishment isn't always visible." That landed differently. The businessman stared at him. There was no bragging in Steven's tone. No name-dropping. No hint of self-promotion. Just certainty. The businessman hesitated before speaking again. "Well," he said carefully, "what's your greatest accomplishment then?" The question echoed louder than intended. Passengers leaned in again. Steven paused, not dramatically, but thoughtfully. Then he answered, "I've helped people become stronger than they thought they could be." No ego. No list of achievements. No grand speech. Just that. The businessman blinked. "That's it." Steven held his gaze. "That's enough." Silence flooded the space between them. And in that silence, something shifted permanently. The businessman could feel it. He was no longer the dominant voice in this exchange. He was the one being examined. The one being measured. And suddenly, his earlier words replayed in his own mind. Standards. Belong. Achievement. They sounded smaller now. Steven leaned slightly closer, not threateningly, but intentionally. "Respect," he said quietly, "is something you give before you ask for it." The line cut deeper than any argument could have. Because it wasn't an attack. It was a lesson. And lessons are harder to dismiss. The businessman opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He realized something uncomfortable. He had tried to belittle a man who never needed validation. He had tried to measure success by appearance. And now, the entire cabin had witnessed it. Steven looked forward again, signaling the conversation was over. He didn't need the last word. He didn't need applause. He didn't need recognition. That confidence, that restraint, said more than any boast ever could. The businessman shifted back in his seat slowly. For the first time since boarding. He wasn't sure of himself. And just as the silence settled, footsteps approached from the aisle. Measured. Purposeful. A flight attendant walking directly toward Steven. And in the next few seconds, everything the businessman believed about the man sitting beside him was about to collapse. The footsteps grew closer. Soft. Professional. Measured. The flight attendant stopped beside Steven's seat and smiled warmly. "Mr. Seagal," she said respectfully, loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear, "the captain wanted me to let you know it's an honor to have you on board today. He was wondering if you'd like to visit the cockpit before landing." Time froze. Not dramatically, but completely. The businessman's face drained of color. The words replayed in his mind. "Mr. Seagal. Honor to have you on board. Cockpit visit." The whispers from earlier suddenly made sense. The glances. The phones. The quiet shift in energy. It wasn't random. It was recognition. Steven gave a polite nod. "That's very kind of him. Thank you." His voice remained calm, the same tone he had used the entire flight. No pride. No victory. No change. And somehow, that made the moment even heavier. The businessman slowly turned his head toward Steven. His earlier confidence was gone, replaced by disbelief. "You're Steven Seagal?" he asked quietly, almost as if he hoped he was wrong. Steven met his eyes briefly. Yes. That was it. No speech. No explanation. Just confirmation. The cabin atmosphere shifted instantly. A few passengers smiled knowingly. Someone softly whispered, "I knew it." Another passenger gave a quiet clap, quickly followed by a few more. Not loud. Not disruptive. But symbolic. The power dynamic had officially reversed. The businessman swallowed hard. Minutes earlier, he had questioned whether Steven belonged in first class. Now he realized he had been sitting beside a globally recognized martial artist, actor, and instructor, a man who had spent decades teaching discipline and self-control. And he had mocked him. Publicly. Pause for a second. What's worse? Being wrong privately, or being wrong in front of an entire cabin at 35,000 feet? Be honest in the comments. And tell me, should Steven forgive him? Yes or no? And if you believe disrespect always comes back around, type karma below. Back to the scene. The businessman's posture collapsed slightly. His shoulders lowered. His voice softened. I didn't realize, he muttered. Steven didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with calm awareness. And that silence felt heavier than any lecture could have been. The flight attendant smiled again. We'll come get you shortly, Mr. Seagal. She walked away. But the damage, or rather, the lesson, had already been delivered. The businessman cleared his throat awkwardly. I meant no disrespect, he said quickly, almost defensively. But the truth was obvious. Disrespect doesn't require intent. It requires assumption. And assumption had driven every word he had spoken since boarding. Steven finally spoke. Respect isn't about knowing who someone is, he said evenly. It's about how you treat them before you know. The businessman felt those words land directly on his conscience. Because that was the difference. If he had known from the beginning who Steven was, he would have behaved differently. And that realization exposed something uncomfortable. He didn't respect the person. He respected the status. There's a powerful lesson here. We often treat people based on what we think they can offer us. Fame, wealth, influence. But real character is revealed in how we treat people when we believe they are ordinary. And in that cabin, everyone had just witnessed the difference between ego and discipline. The businessman exhaled slowly. I apologize, he said quietly now. Not performative. Not loud. Just honest. The surrounding passengers noticed the shift. The tension that had filled the air earlier was dissolving. But the weight of the lesson remained. Steven gave a small nod. Apology accepted. No sarcasm. No humiliation. No victory speech. Because true confidence doesn't need revenge. It doesn't need to embarrass someone who has already embarrassed themselves. That's the difference between strength and ego. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming passengers and thanking Mr. Steven Seagal for being on board. The confirmation echoed throughout the cabin. There was no longer any doubt. The businessman closed his eyes briefly. Regret has a unique feeling. It's quiet, heavy, personal. He replayed his earlier comments in his head. Standards. Belong. Achievement. Each word now sounded small. Steven stood calmly as another attendant approached to escort him forward. As he stepped into the aisle, several passengers smiled respectfully. Not because of his fame, but because of how he handled himself. Grace under pressure. Discipline in the face of disrespect. As he walked forward, the businessman remained seated, humbled. Not destroyed. Not attacked. Just awakened. And sometimes, that's the strongest correction of all. Because humiliation fades. But lessons stay. And when Steven returned to his seat a few minutes later, the dynamic between them would never be the same again. The plane began its descent. Outside the window, the clouds parted slowly, revealing the city lights below. Inside the cabin, however, the atmosphere had changed completely. The earlier tension was gone. In its place was something quieter. Reflection. Steven returned from the cockpit visit and took his seat calmly, fastening his seatbelt without saying a word. No pride. No visible satisfaction. Just the same composed presence he had maintained since boarding. The businessman sat stiffly beside him, staring straight ahead. His earlier arrogance had disappeared. Now there was only silence and thought. As the aircraft lowered through the sky, he finally turned slightly toward Steven. His voice was no longer sharp. It was human. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. Steven looked at him, not surprised. The businessman swallowed. I judged you without knowing anything about you. I assumed things I shouldn't have. There was no audience now. No performance. Just two men having a real moment. Steven nodded once. We all make assumptions, he replied calmly. What matters is what we learn from them. The businessman exhaled slowly. I was out of line. Yes, Steven said gently. You were. But there was no anger in his tone. Only honesty. And sometimes, honesty without hostility is more powerful than any confrontation. The plane touched down smoothly on the runway. A soft thud. A slight bounce. Then applause, the kind passengers give pilots after a safe landing. But this time, a few claps weren't just for the pilot. They were subtle acknowledgments of something else. Dignity. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, the businessman spoke again. I confuse confidence with superiority sometimes. Steven looked at him thoughtfully. Confidence doesn't need comparison, he said. Superiority does. The businessman nodded slowly. Those words stayed with him. Because deep down, he knew they were true. He had tried to establish status by diminishing someone else. And that attempt had exposed more about him than it ever did about Steven. It's easy to respect someone when you know their achievements. It's harder, and more meaningful, to respect someone when you don't. That's where character lives. And that's what everyone in that cabin had just witnessed. The seatbelt sign turned off. Passengers began gathering their belongings. Several people passed Steven with small smiles and quiet nods. Not celebrity excitement. Respect. The businessman stood as well. Before stepping into the aisle, he turned one last time. Thank you, he said. For what? Steven asked. For not humiliating me when you could have. Steven gave a faint smile. Embarrassment is temporary, he replied. Growth can be permanent. Those words settled deeply. As passengers exited the aircraft, a few discreet photos had already been posted online. Within hours, short clips and stories began circulating. Steven Seagal teaches powerful lesson on flight. Calm response shuts down arrogant businessman. True strength isn't loud. The story spread. Not because of conflict, but because of composure. People weren't praising Steven for being famous. They were praising him for staying disciplined under pressure. For proving that real strength doesn't shout. It doesn't insult back. It doesn't escalate. It corrects quietly. The businessman, meanwhile, walked through the terminal differently than he had boarded. Slower. Quieter. More aware. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons happen in the most unexpected places. And sometimes the person you underestimate ends up teaching you the most. Steven exited the airport without drama. No press. No attention-seeking. Just another calm walk forward. But everyone who witnessed that flight would remember it. Not because a celebrity was on board, but because they saw what dignity looks like in real time. And that image lasts longer than headlines. Let me ask you something. How often do we judge people based on appearance? On clothing? On tone? On assumptions? What would change if we chose respect first, every time? If you believe no one should be judged by how they look, type respect in the comments. And tell me, what country and city are you watching from? If this story meant something to you, subscribe for more powerful lessons like this one. Because strength isn't about dominance. It's about discipline. And respect is always free.